themes, and really capture that. So we'll get a draft around, and then we'll ask for everybody to review, tighten it up. So we have, you know, we have a document that goes beyond our 90 minutes here.
Okay.
I think it would be good to stick to some key messages.
Yeah, I might not be agreement, but at least our voice will be.
Absolutely. I mean, what are the key themes, even where there is not agreement? That's an important thing to get in there.
Sounds good.
And so we'll do it in the form of kind of executive summary of the top things that have been more running dialogue. So we'll look at that. Okay. Great. We have a few minutes, so coffee and restroom.
Yes.
It's probably really good. While we
May I suggest restroom and coffee?
Yeah.
Because taking the coffee to the restroom is not hygienic at all.
You never know.
So we're going to figure out. Okay.
So now you have 2 pads.
Can I get this from you?
Now there are 2.
Oh, there.
You can take mine,
stuff?
Erica. You can take
Oh,
mine.
there it goes
I
here.
have a notebook, so.
Okay.
Oh, that's right, you have.
There's more.
Now
Huh?
you have a lot.
We can just keep stacking.
We never know. Typically, work is more than not just pictures, so. Not a good idea.
This is the first kind of this type of panel I'm doing. Do people generally read their statements?
Sometimes I sometimes read, sometimes not. So depends on you. I wrote mine because English is not my first language.
Yeah.
So I know what I'm saying.
Yes.
You know?
So you'll just, I mean, people do have materials in front of them to go through. It's not like you stand up and talk, right?
Even if I stand
everybody's-
up and talk, I put my materials.
Okay, good.
No, it depends whatever you feel comfortable.
Yeah, okay.
I try to be precise, and English is not my first language, so I have it
Language.
just in case
Yeah.
I forget a word. Jeez, there's nobody. The audience is. Oh no, we are 30 minutes earlier. Okay. internet here, you know.
Yesterday, just
And password, do you know the password? No.
it's just is there one called IG?
Okay.
Yeah, it should be the one called IGF Invoker. Should it be this one?
So big.
Yeah, it's that
Okay,
one.
thank you. So big, this building. Huge. Yeah. I came earlier. Yeah. So you're the new Ayusha?
Oh
No.
not at
Okay.
all. I'm
Who?
intern.
Okay.
Yeah.
And who is replacing Ayusha? Ayusha.
Well, so Constance was
I guess that's
yes,
it.
well she's standing in for now, still looking for a senior property manager.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, okay. That one was open. Very nice to see you.
Nice to meet you.
So, from there.
If you get another table, you can change it around. I'm happy to be here. I can control you all that.
Yeah, yeah. You have the remote, right?
You do something wrong, I will do that. You don't need a gun if you have a German. Germans don't need a gun, we do it with our voices. You're Swiss? That's close enough, Germans, come on. It's all one tribe. More or less. Exactly. Where are you from? Huh? Bern? That's very nice. That's actually very nice.
So within one day, let's get a draft. May or may not. So, Mukesh, when did you arrive?
I'm based here.
Oh, so you're based here?
Yeah.
Wait a second.
Yeah, I'm based here. I've been here for 6 years now.
I thought you were in Dubai.
No. I'm based here. Actually, our regional headquarters is in Dubai.
Okay. Maybe that's what it was
yes.
from when I was raised.
I started out
you
as
haven't
a
been to Cappadocia yet.
no, so that's a shame.
It's a 1 hour flight.
I know. You never see what's in your backyard, right? So
It is worth it. I would say.
is it okay?
This summary, I wrote my speech. So I can
That's great. Okay, so that's great.
Yeah.
Just send it straight out. That's even better.
make-
And if you
it'll
want to
make life-
highlight certain parts of it that you want to really make sure are the highlights, just put yellow bold on that and send it over, and that makes it even easier.
You already have mine, Eric.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. That's right. My PC is back over it.
I do that because of English, it's my second language. I want to make sure I'm precise.
Perfect. Sounds good. are you in Washington?
I'm
Or
based
where?
in San Francisco.
Oh, you are. Okay. Lucky you.
Yeah.
That's great. And then travel a lot?
I travel quite a bit and manage a project. I'm the international director of human rights, and so I've been working a lot in Latin America, 14 countries in Latin America.
Right.
But also I do the missions and some global opportunities.
Okay.
70% of my time.
Will you be in New York for parts of the General Assembly?
Yeah, probably. My colleague, right now there is a meeting. So my colleague is going there because I'm here.
Yeah.
And then after here, I'm going to the Human Rights Council in Geneva.
Okay. Yeah.
So we are dividing.
Yeah,
too
there's a
much.
lot going on. Well, this time of year, it's always,
September.
it's amazing.
Ah, we've got a table.
Great.
Pardon, bu ekranı da kapatabilir misiniz? Kullanmayacağız çünkü. Just scoot over a little bit. Eric, are they gonna have roving mics or? What?
Which company? Oh,
With IDC.
I
I'm an analyst, yeah. I'm a technology market analyst. Part of the IDG group, yes.
Bertrand's right there.
He's right here. Yes.
Reviewing the paper,
I
I was
see.
just wondering if you would have it, but I have no idea.
Okay.
No, I couldn't see John either. No, that's why I was wondering. Yeah.
I'm going on vacation.
No, John.
Here. Ah, okay. It's a lovely place. I've been there before. Yes. Kash, it's a lovely place. Yeah. There's lots of boat cruises that leave from Kash. So you can take a different day cruise every day to take you through the islands and the coast. Some areas you can only reach by boat. There are no roads there, so it's very nice. It's a nice spot.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And I don't think I need one up here because I can just, we should just have this in the audience just to share here. This are going to, we're going to just pass it.
at ISOC. So it's great. Yeah. She's
Nice one.
That's what I was going to do. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to go. Yeah. Yeah, I've said. Yeah, I've sorted that out. So the girl there said that she was going to do it, but I'm going to stand close to see. Yeah. To see, if I should then go get my mind put in it. Okay.
Jenny, after this, I'm gonna head back. That's it. After this is. Yes, US bylaws. That's what it is. Yeah, that's okay. That's requirement elsewhere.
That is in the main building. As you come into the main building, it's storm
Yes.
and the storm of that just
Got it.
not on the left or
Great,
right.
great, great.
Right up.
Thanks.
For our panel on internet technology and policy, privacy, data flows, and trust. Very pleased to have all of you in the audience here today. And I should say not just audience, but participants. One of the things that's going to be very important for the success of our conversation today is that after some introductory remarks from the panelists who will share their perspectives and areas of expertise, we certainly want to ensure that we have a strong exchange of ideas. So from the floor, it can be a question, it can be a statement, it can be a comment. There are so many people who are in this room as I look around who have a lot of very important ideas in this area. So we look forward to your engagement on this. Let me just share a few introductory words about the topic and our goals for this morning, and then very brief introduction of the panelists who will do best of introducing themselves through their statements. We're here talking about different evolving internet technologies, cloud, big data, data analytics. They hold the promise to bring a lot of profound benefits, addressing important societal issues in all forms, different sectors. And at the same time, the power of these tools, they also raise very important societal and legal concerns around privacy, data security, certainly around issues of jurisdiction, issues of competition, things that people here are quite familiar with. All stakeholders in the internet ecosystem have expectations of data protection and privacy in their communications. And businesses, government, civil society, users, all presently are engaged in important dialogues aiming to restore and ensure trust in evolving internet technologies. So The participants here today are going to talk about different elements of these dialogues, including certainly areas about encryption, privacy enhancements, areas of rule of law, cross-jurisdictional issues, interplay of innovation, data use, and of course all the other topics I started off with. All dimensions of this conversation are important, and they all need protecting. We need, of course, to respect customers' privacy and maintain trust of users. That's critical, it's paramount to any company that has a long view of its relationship with customers. And likewise, it's important to recognize that when subject to adequate procedures and oversight, legitimate access to user data by governments for security reasons also is important for the government role of protecting safety and security. I'm sure we're going to hear some discussions about similarly when subject to adequate oversight and procedures, there are many important private sector activities for innovation and beneficial services. So among the topics that we're going to explore on this panel, in an age of rapidly accelerating technology, how do we best detect concerns with privacy or data security, whether originating from government or private sector? What kind of procedures and independent oversight is appropriate to resolve or reduce these problems? How do you best apply procedure when the activity transpires in several jurisdictions? And when we do need to balance privacy interests with either government security or private sector innovation, how should we measure these benefits and costs on both sides of the equation? What are some successful practices that we can look towards for examples? These are all subjects that the different people on this panel are going to raise. And fortunately, we have a great set of experience here. So just to be brief with my introductions, and we'll jump into things. Next to me, Ana Neves, who's the director of the Department of Information Society at the FCT in Portugal. And Ana serves as director there. She's the Portuguese delegate in several working parties related to information society and research at the EU, OECD, UN, ITU, and at ICANN, and participates at the IGF many years. So welcome, glad to have you here. Next, Mukesh Shilani. He's based here in Istanbul, the program director for IDC, Government Insights, covering the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa. And we'll bring some good experience here on different developments throughout industry. Bertrand de la Chapelle is the director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. And Bertrand has had several important roles with the IGF. From 2006 to 2010, he was the French thematic ambassador and special envoy for Information Society, participating in all WSIS follow-up activities and internet governance processes, including in particular the IGF. He also was the vice chair of ICANN's Government Advisory Committee. And next we have Thomas Grob. Roland Dahl, who's in the program for DT, regrettably is not feeling well, wasn't able to travel. Thankfully, we have Thomas with us, who is the strategic director on several legal and policy issues for DT, working on international matters. And Thomas, it's great to have you here today. Thank you. Next, Katica Rodriguez, International Rights Director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. She concentrates on comparative policy of international privacy issues, with special emphasis on law enforcement, government surveillance, and cross-border data flows. Thank you, Katica. We look forward to your comments. And then next, Joe Aladef, Vice President of Global Public Policy and the Chief Privacy Strategist at Oracle, as well as the Chair of the ICC Digital Economy Commission. And finally, myself, Eric Loeb. I am the Vice President of International External Affairs with AT&T, and also I co-chair the ICC's Internet and Telecommunications Task Force. So this is our group. The audience will get to know you with your interventions as we go through the day. The structure of the panel today, we want to talk first about some of the challenges under the topic that I've addressed, and then importantly, ideas on the way forward. After that, we'll turn to time for interventions from the floor, as I said, either questions or comments, and we look forward to that.
And with that, if I may ask Anna, would you like to start by sharing some initial remarks on either significant policy or business developments and concerns that are having an impact on user trust in the medium?
Thank you very much. I have here the main concerns that we are discussing at the level of governments. And for the time being, I'm going to underline some of them, and I think that later on I will talk a little bit on how we are trying to cope with these main concerns. We know that we are in an area with different cultural frameworks, different values, which leads to different concepts of privacy. Even myself, in 2006, I have a concept of privacy that is not the same that I have today. So if it is only with myself, so I can imagine what is
have national frameworks governing cloud adoption, for instance. What this means is that government entities are driven by champions. They're driven by people brave enough to attempt to implement, in spite the lack of a common framework. And what's happening as well is this is requiring them to think of what are the acceptable certifications? What are the acceptable service level agreements? And this is happening on a one-off basis rather than having a common framework across the entire of the government to say that this is, as a government, how we ought to approach implementation. Just give you an example. The latest audit by the South African Auditor General on provincial and local government outcomes on IT controls found that at its best, only 30% of provincial and local entities in South Africa have an effective functioning security management control or IT service continuity plan. So only 30% at its best have that. So how do you move forward? Brave leaders, CIOs in the government can take a step forward, but there's a certain degree of fear that their hands are going to get slapped if they take a wrong step. And lastly, just the issue of trust and data sovereignty. So there's the concern of where is this data going to live? The concern of, I don't want to place the data beyond my national borders. So that's controlled to some extent by private clouds, but the adoption of public clouds are certainly inhibited, at least stated, at least verbally stated, because of this. We are nonetheless quite optimistic about the future. I've been a downer at 9 in the morning, but our view for the future is quite positive, and we'll get to that later on. Thank you for your attention.
I'd say that where Mukesh left off is a great place for Bertrand to pick up with his work on cross-jurisdictional issues.
You mean on the optimistic part? Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. One of the things that I would like to share, basically, as Eric mentioned, I'm the director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. And in a nutshell, the purpose of this thing is to address this major issue of the tension between the cross-border nature of the Internet and the national jurisdictions. We are in an environment where the technology has been conceived as global from the onset. The system of the Internet is fundamentally global. It is a border rather than borderless, or is cross-border. Meanwhile, the legal system that exists is fundamentally fragmented. It is based on the geographic nation states, and for a lot of us, the history has brought basically millions, if not hundreds of millions of dead people, just to draw the line very precisely between one country and the next. My law here, your law there. The international system is based on that. It's the non-intrusion or non-interference in the affairs of others. The international system is based on the separation of sovereignty. My sovereignty here, your sovereignty there. The only problem is that when we talk about the Internet, the great benefit that the Internet has brought, and not only the Internet, but the services that are built upon the Internet, the platforms, the cloud, and all the rest, are fundamentally accessible anywhere in the world technically. And that's the intention. This is why it supports innovation. This is why somebody who creates a startup, which is, by the way, something I did in the 90s, when the Internet was not as developed as it is today, this is why creators of startup can immediately reach out users all around the world. The problem is, as those activities develop and the interactions between people develop across borders, which is the purpose, which is what we want, which is what we want to enable, the more you get geographic criteria that are attached to the definition and determination of applicable laws. It can be the location of the user, location of the server, the incorporation of the company, any other intermediary that comes into the way can be a trigger for the application of a particular law. The problem also is compounded by the fact that as the internet grows and the adoption of it grows, the diversity of people who use it also grows. And this means very naturally a diversity of norms, of references in many aspects that are not always compatible. So if you compile all those elements, we get in a situation where there is a patchwork of national legislations, a patchwork of individual sensitivities, and shared online spaces. This is particularly true, this problem is particularly acute for hosting platforms. The Facebooks, the YouTube, Twitter, and other companies of this world, and any other that can be in a different country. It can be Weibo, it can be WeChat, or others. Because they are serving users in all countries. These users are posting something that may perfectly be illegal in one of the countries that receive it. And we do not have, I will not belabor now, but we don't have a framework internationally to handle this. The mutual legal assistance treaties are completely inappropriate because they deal only with criminal things, and sometimes it's not criminal in both countries. That's one of the problems. And the big challenge, and I finish with that, the big challenge and the thing that I would really like to highlight is there are situations where, not to be pedantic, but Immanuel Kant had this thing about the categoric imperative, like what is something good and what is something bad, irrespective of religion of the rest. And to paraphrase heavily, the categoric imperative says something is good if it's scalable, something is bad if it's not scalable. I.e., if I want everybody to behave the way I behave, that's a good thing. If I want nobody else but me and be a free rider, that's a bad behavior. And a key criteria today, the reason why I mention this is because we are in a situation where by lack of coordination, or at least discussion and cooperation, things that are fostered by places like the IGF and other mechanisms, that's the one I do, the chance is that every single entity, every government, every company, and the rest will take individual decisions in a typical prisoner's dilemma situation. And each decision will look perfectly reasonable, perfectly appropriate, at least in the short term. The problem is that it's a complex dynamic system, and the cumulative effect of all the individual decisions lead to something that everybody wants to avoid, i.e. the fragmentation, the partitioning, the reapplication of the Westphalian system on the internet. And so we're in an environment where cooperation is more needed than ever to address those issues. And privacy is a very important one, but issues related to speech is also a very big challenge. And the Internet and Jurisdiction Project is one of the attempts at designing a procedural framework to handle the trans-border requests that are now growing between governments and global operators. But I close here and pass the baton.
Yes, thank you very much, Bertrand. This was exactly the right introduction to what I was going to say, because coming from an operator that is based in Germany, in a country that has very high standards regarding data protection regarded internationally, we also have the concern that we have fragmentation in this space. Now, of course, high standards also come at a cost, but I'm not going to argue to lower the standards for us as an enterprise to have lower costs. On the other hand, I'm going to say to the opposite, that it's actually an investment in the trust, because we need this trust. We see in studies that especially German citizens, which are rather sensitive to these topics, despite being protected already by very high standards, the survey shows that 31% of Germans regard data security and misuse of data as a great risk, and 74% believe that this risk is even going to increase in the future. Now, 28% are very worried that their personal data is passed forward by companies without their permission, And again, 74% believe that this risk is going to increase in the future. So despite stepping up the protection on the legal side, we really do have a trust issue here with our customers. And as a company, we need to make everything possible to ensure that this trust will come back. Now, while we're talking about in this legal space here, we also have to acknowledge that we're not talking about what internet companies are doing with private data, being allowed or not allowed by German rules, but also what people that simply don't care, whatever the rules are doing. Talking about attacks from cyberspace, there is ways, and personal data is a valued good, as we can see. So as a network operator, we have a very distinct role in doing whatever we can on the network side to protect our customers against those attacks which essentially try to extract private data. I'll leave it at this for the moment and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have asked to speak 5 minutes about the problem. In the second round, a little about the way forward or solutions. So I want to remind, I work for a civil society organization. So for us, when we talk about trust, probably we are saying we really have trust, and we remember, and I want to remind people what we have learned the last year from the Snowden disclosures about the specific details of how the NSA and its allies have been spying on much of the world's communications. The foreign intelligence agencies of this nation have conducted a web of interoperability at the technical and operational level that spans the entire globe. We have learned the extent of the cooperation and intelligence sharing among these countries and have witnessed how material gathered under one country's surveillance regime is readily shared with others. We have learned that those agencies are not the only one, but many other intelligence agencies are also spying upon innocent individuals. We have built an internet that is insecure, vulnerable to all and every attacker. This last year, we also have learned that the NSA has strayed far from its legitimate goal of protecting national security. In fact, we have seen the NSA participating in economic espionage, diplomatic spying, suspicionless surveillance of entire populations. Even worse, the NSA has also covertly weakened products and standards that internet users need to protect themselves against online spying. This culture of collecting all information, sniff all information, process all information, exploit all information, partner all information is not sustainable. NSA is undermining the encryption tools relied upon by ordinary users, companies, financial institutions, targets and not targets, as part of the Bull Run program, an unparalleled effort to weaken the security of all internet users, including you. The NSA program Muscular infiltrated links between the global data centers of technology companies like Google and Yahoo. Many companies have responded to those revelations by encrypting traffic over their internal networks. The NSA monitored telephones, call and text messages for many government officials. And also, the NSA documents show that not all governments are clear about their own level of cooperation with the NSA. As one of the news media report, The Intercept says, few, if any, elected leaders have any knowledge of the surveillance. But certainly, what they use will not affect what other countries is doing. If you reign in the NSA or you reign in the GCQ, other countries like China will do it and probably win. There is a flawed arms race argument. We will never solve this if we keep that argument. We have built, again, a secure internet for everyone and enabled the panopticon of observation of everyone's activities where freedom and liberty are lost. The mere existence of mass surveillance apparatus, regardless of how it's used, is in itself sufficient to stifle dissent. A citizenry that is aware of always being watched quickly become a compliance and a fearful one. Self-censorship is a problem. We have lost trust in technology and protocols and institutions who run the internet. Again, we have built an insecure internet, but we do have a solution. An internet is vulnerable to all attackers, or internet is secure for everyone. In the second part, I will propose some ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I'm going to be the bridge to the second panel, because what I want to do is talk a little bit about the ecosystem we're in and then why that ecosystem creates some of the challenges. So if you think about where we are today, we live in an ecosystem, and this is ever more so, of people connected with people, objects connected with objects, and people connected with objects that exist in computer-aware environments that can avail themselves of services delivered through the clouds that are supported by advanced analytics. So that's cloud, that's the Internet of Things, that's big data. That is the emerging technologies, but they are not silos, they are a unified ecosystem. And they can create significant benefits. There was an example of a hospital in Toronto that treated premature births, and those babies are very susceptible to fever. And usually what happens is those babies are treated in real time. They have one nurse to every 2 babies. The second the baby gets in distress, the nurse runs in and gives whatever treatment is necessary to the baby. But what they decided to do is they decided to collect the information, because those babies are hooked up to any number of sensors. So they started to collect the information, and they found a completely counterintuitive result. 24 hours before the baby spikes a substantial fever, a fever that can be fatal, all of the vital signs of the baby stabilize. Normally a sign that the baby's doing better because the vital signs are stable. No one knows exactly why that happens, but the correlation allowed them to start treating babies because there's a very low contraindication for treatment for fever. So they started treating the babies for fever the second the vitals stabilized, and it turns out they lowered infant mortality, decreased the amount of time the baby was susceptible to the fever, and dramatically improved patient outcomes. That is the potential benefit that we get from these technologies, which is a benefit that is not incidental to lose. However, when you think about secondary uses of health data, the challenge that we face is we are removing the person from participation in some of these decisions, because the ability to get consent in these scenarios becomes more challenging. So part of the question becomes, as we go to technologies that operate remotely, that operate as a distance, whether it's sensors in things that you don't know exist, or other ways in which information is collected in a non-obvious manner, or if we have previously collected information that might be useful in order to do things like save lives, the problem becomes our traditional model is a model where someone has been given notice and an opportunity to make a decision related to that notice. Yes, I want you to collect. No, I don't want you to collect. Yes, I want you to use. No, I don't want you to use. These are the limits. It has been, by any stretch of the imagination, a very imperfect dialogue to date. But now the dialogue is disappearing because the hallmarks of what used to be the state of that dialogue, I can see collection of my information, are disappearing. I understand use of my information is disappearing. In fact, our value chains are becoming so complex that it's difficult to think that someone actually understands how their information is being used across any number of different participants to that value chain. In many cases, these are neutral uses of information that just include, well, this person is processing the information to support this person who is doing this, all of which may be something you know, but you don't know all the pieces of the puzzle. But sometimes it's things that would surprise you. Sometimes it's things that would surprise and annoy you. Sometimes it's things that would surprise, annoy, and actually make you irate. So the question becomes, we have in some ways removed the individual from the equation. And you cannot do that unless there is a compelling societal reason where you would want to do that. And if you do that, what are you substituting in place of that? What is the protection that is being substituted? What is the oversight? What is the assurance that the correct things are being done with your information that is being put in place? And we have been told to hold our solutions to round two, so that was kind of like the teaser on the news program, and the substantial story will be coming later.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as we get into the next phase of this, people play off of each other with solutions, so we'll have to. So you know, from the first round of comments, as you've heard, and many of the things that you're familiar with, there's in the background a context of the range of societal benefits, not just from these technologies, but from the flow of information. And as one person said on a panel I was listening to recently, you know, innovation doesn't know any borders, it doesn't know any boundaries, but we have some jurisdictional challenges that have been brought up. And as we've gone through and talked about the challenges, certainly we've heard about the security attacks and inadequate investments that have been made to protect against those and the issues of trust around that. Certainly a strong theme around surveillance practices, both scope and also adequacy of procedure as safeguards, and that's an issue for many jurisdictions to consider. Private sector practices with the use of data and the transparency of those practices, and then of course, as Bertrand has highlighted, the cross-jurisdictional conflicts. So as we now get into this next phase of the discussion, unless we want to just sit here and say, well, you know, it's a zero-sum game of trade-offs. These are all important, but they're conflicting priorities. If there is, in fact, not just a zero-sum, but ways forward that can improve the current situation, we want to bring up some different ideas and concrete concepts here, and that's really the next issue of focus for this panel. So we'll go down again and talk about different ideas on policy, legal, stakeholder initiatives. We'll go down the road, but I really do encourage, as anyone does raise a point that triggers an idea someone else has, we'll have some interventions, and after that, of course, as I said, really welcome to have some participation from the audience as well. Anna, if you'd like to start.
Okay. Okay, so I think I'm going to use now my slot to present you what I think it's the way forward, and some recommendations that we are discussing at the governmental level. I have here some, but I like to share them with you. So to surpass all these obstacles that we heard, I think that we, from the governmental side, we have to foster discussions with all the stakeholders, to mediate the discussions between users and enterprises, who too often perceive their interests as being antagonist. So to make really the multi-stakeholder model work. Another important thing is to identify responsibilities for each party with an interest in the data-driven economy, and clearly assign such responsibilities to an entity or group of entities, and establish accountability and enforcement mechanisms. To revise the legal framework where possible. So I'm Portuguese, I'm from the European Union, so I'm in the middle of the European Union discussions. And in the European Union, on the 25th of January 2012, the European Commission released its data protection law reform package for discussion by the member states. So 2 new pieces of European law: a general data protection regulation and a directive on processing for crime and criminal justice, intend to repeal and replace the EU directive and framework decision from 2008 on data protection in police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters. So this one is from 2008, so in 2012, 4 years later, the European Commission presented another package. Other mechanisms are also under discussion, including a European data protection seal program that would allow certified organizations to transfer to and receive personal data from other certified organizations, irrespective of their location. Governments should promote practices, exchange of best practices and codes of conduct among different stakeholders by the recognition of international standards. The main stakeholders in this process should share, should agree, and follow best practices, policies regarding international conventions such as the fundamental rights, international law. By promoting something that is very important, I think, privacy by design. So technological solutions such as apps and services must have privacy and security concerns from the very beginning of its development or implementation. To promote interdisciplinary technological research with other scientific areas than the technological ones only, such as history, culture, sociology, psychology, economics, to better address societal concerns and better understand societies and behaviors. To explore new business models that ensure mutual benefits for both the organizations, private sector, and individuals, and to clear privacy and information security policies to know who does what with this data. Users and consumers should be aware of the data collected, the information produced, and its use. Governments should also ensure a tailored approach by sector to address sectorial differences and needs, as it depends on whether we are dealing with the public healthcare, energy networks, transport, commerce, trade, national security, environment preservation. Governments could establish a certification framework for secure and privacy-friendly data management practices in enterprises. So, the data privacy certificates could be promoted as a seal of quality. Especially enterprises like e-commerce services and major online retailers could benefit from advertising that their company's data secure and privacy friendly. The process could be supervised by a specific entity responsible for monitoring the data privacy practices and issuing the certificates. Such data management best practices clearinghouse could also play the role of conceding licenses for and supervising enterprises developing new data security related services such as data safe havens and the use of techniques such as anonymization, so removing personally identifiable information that could be used to link data to an identified or identifiable person, personal aggregation, combining related personal data sets into larger aggregation of data, and personal data parameterization, converting data into a set of parameters that capture valuable insights without including information about a person or their digital identity. And finally, governments should consider fiscal incentives for enterprises which adopt data secure and privacy-friendly practices, as well as for stimulating the creation and uptake of privacy by design goods and services. And these are my 2 cents from the governmental point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Again, I'm going to give an industry skew, a perspective on what vendors, technology vendors, and what end users are actually doing. So we start off with the assumption that do you believe that end users of third platform technology, so cloud, big data, etc., do you believe that they expect security to be a given when they work throughout these systems. And we've done a survey early this year. We asked respondents, these are CIOs globally, we asked them to describe their stance on what security responsibilities should be between themselves, their organizations, and cloud service providers. So on one end of the scale, we asked them, do you believe this is a caveat emptor or a buyer beware situation where all the risk is on your side? 1.5% said yes. On the other end of the scale, we asked them, do you believe this is the sole problem of the vendor? And 40% said, yes, we agree to that. So everyone in the middle, 58% or so, said this is a shared responsibility. This cannot be solved by one side nor the other. And actually, we've done further digging to find out what they mean. So from an end user perspective, the expectation is that end users deploying cloud services, in particular, in this case, want encryption at some level deployed within their environments. In addition, they're also interested in technologies on-premise, so within their facilities, within their control, that can be used to create and maintain secure connections and monitor the use of cloud technologies. So we're talking here about federated identity, single sign-on solutions. We're talking about host-based security, firewall, host-based intrusion prevention systems. So from the end user side, there is that move. We asked them, in the absence of any government frameworks within your nation, what do you use to decide whether a cloud provider is safe, quote unquote, to use in a public scale? And the answer was, we would use third-party certifications, including third-party government certifications. So you may end up with governments across Middle East and Africa looking at FedRAMP or looking at the UK's G-Cloud as a proxy. So if it's good enough for the US, it's good enough for the UK. That standard is sufficiently high. And if the cloud provider is capable of providing that, that would be okay with us, with one exception. The data resides within our national jurisdiction. So it goes back to what Bertrand is saying, is the fragmentation of this. But vendors are not sitting idle as well. We have a lot of interactions with vendors, and this is public cloud is a $90 billion market in 2016, growing at 37% CAGR. To give you an idea, that is 14 times the size of overall IT market growth rate. So, they're not about to sit and watch that market move away. There's a lot of effort by the technology vendors to actually scale up their security. So you look at the vendors who have hyperscale are actually looking to embed security by design as well. So security by design is a big focus. But in addition, they're also looking to partner with other security-focused organizations. So you have, for instance, Amazon Web Services partnering with SafeNet to develop a security appliance, Cloud HSM. Or you would have a small cloud provider, relatively small, I should say, Firehost, who would put together security pieces from vendors to assemble something rather customized and end-to-end from their perspective. So there are, from the industry perspective, there are certainly moves to make sure that the future for cloud, the future for third platform technologies is safer and thereby encourage greater adoption.
I'd like to start by piggybacking on Eric's comment about zero-sum game. You know that in game theory you have three possibilities: zero-sum game, negative-sum games, and positive-sum games. What I was describing in the first part is typically the emergence of a negative-sum game at the moment. the legal competition is actually detrimental for everyone. The problem is that there are not that many alternative options, and zero-sum games in that kind of very complex environments is not really an option because you're always hovering above and below. It's not like distributing a portion of a cake. The key question is there a way, and this goes to the optimistic or non-optimistic question earlier, is there a way to discuss this in something that is more positive, a positive sum game? I do think it is. And the reason why I think it is because the issue that we've decided to tackle in the Internet and Jurisdiction project, just as an illustration or example, is something that is a problem for all actors. In a nutshell, because the international treaties do not exist, because the MLATs do not function for the kind of issues we're talking about, i.e. content that is posted in one country that is illegal in another one, the solution that has been adopted by a lot of countries, law enforcement and public authorities, is to actually send direct requests to the platforms themselves, to the Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others of this world. And this rise in transborder requests is something that is a burden for companies, obviously. It is something that is considered as non-satisfactory by civil society groups who are worried that private companies are making decisions on sensitive issues regarding freedom of expression or privacy. And it is something that is not satisfactory in most cases for the governments because, to be frank, some of the requests are not necessarily handled or there's no answer because their own level of, let's say, due process is not what it should be in many cases. And so we're in a situation of tension where the zero-sum game that is playing out is that operators are being blocked in some countries, the governments are dissatisfied, and when the interaction is resulting in a decision, civil society is legitimately concerned that the system is opaque. That's a wonderful situation for cooperation because everybody has a problem with the current situation. The key question is how do you get out of this conundrum? And here I've been an advocate of multi-stakeholder approaches from 2000 or 2001. And if I ever needed confirmation that things change when you put people around the same table, that would have been the confirmation for me. In the last 2.5 years, we've held 13 meetings in more than 10 countries. About 70 entities have been participating in one way or another in the process. Governments, including India, Brazil, the United States, France, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, major platforms like Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, civil society groups like CDT, CIS in India, FGV, the Council of Europe, OECD. But when you get people together and you make them work progressively, you end up defining what is emerging now, i.e. a due process or an effort at a due process framework. Something that raises the bar of predictability of procedures, transparency, avenues for redress, and mechanisms for dispute management. Because one of the big challenges is that there is no overarching mechanism today. We don't have treaties, and there is no way to arbitrate basically between a country and a company. This is not a way you normally deal with issues. The court in one country cannot decide on the company in another one unless they have boots on the ground and so on. And vice versa, it would be inappropriate to see the law of, for instance, the United States, because the company is incorporated in the United States, apply worldwide. So we're in a conundrum. And in many cases, I take the opportunity to mention that the argument that says it is very troubling that private companies are making determinations that are quasi-judiciary is a valid concern, and I share it, and I'm sure a lot of us share it. the key challenge is if we say it should be the courts that make those decisions, the question becomes, yes, okay, but which court? Is it the court of the country that is making the request, which means that if one country says this content is not legal in my country, it should not be visible anywhere? Makes no sense. If, on the other hand, it is the court of the country of incorporation of the platform, it means that the law of that country applies worldwide, which is not acceptable either, even if it is a decision that is being discussed at the moment on the Microsoft case that a lot of you may have heard. So, in a nutshell, the question is, how do you design a process that makes sure that the requests that are being made by law enforcement or public authorities are sufficiently complete, have sufficient information and sufficient basis, that there's a format for those requests that raises the bar of due process, that there are mechanisms that collect data to produce transparency reporting, and furthermore, that there are common sets of criteria that can be developed, and that's what we're doing at the moment, between the platforms, the governments, the civil society group, international organizations, to make the decision-making predictable and to make sure that there is an element of predictability, that there's an element of understanding how things are working. But the most important, and I'm finished with that, the most important and most difficult thing is how to handle the situations where the process has been improved, everything is working nicely in such a framework, but there is still a discrepancy between the country that requests something and the company that says, you know what, actually no. Give you a concrete example. There are situations, and it is probably pertinent to mention this in this region, there are situations of cross-border global public order issues. Something is being posted in one country that triggers a local situation or hatred or ethnic clashes and so on. In such cases, it is obvious that each party will want to go in the side of caution. The country will request very early takedown of the content that is illegal in the country and so on, and the platform very legitimately will err on the side of caution and say, I want to make sure that freedom of expression is maintained, and unless there is a real valid reason to do this, we will not take that down. In the current situation, there is no mechanism for dialogue. There is no red phone, there is no procedure pre-established to discuss whether the concerns are real, whether they're not, if they can be accommodated in the respect of human rights. At the moment, there's just a tension that is growing and that triggers additional restrictions in the national laws and the fragmentation in the negative system. I'll give you a very personal experience 2 days ago. Somebody in the hotel room near mine was making noise at 11:30 at night. And I did something that I shouldn't have done, which is, after having knocking the first time on the door to ask them to calm down, where they accepted kindly, an hour later when it was continuing, I knocked again. And then a very sturdy man, pretty aggressive, open, took me and threw me on the ground, which was a little bit unpleasant, I would say. The reason why I mention this is because I, of course, called the security. And the security came and calmed things down and asked the guy to come in, and I could make a complaint. If there had been nobody to call, nothing to not arbitrate but facilitate the tension alleviation, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe I would be here with a big bad eye. We don't have that kind of thing at the international level at the moment on those issues. It is growing. We're in an environment where tensions are growing because people are very different in this space. It is normal that they're different. It is good that they're different. And what we need to build is, at least in this space, mechanisms that alleviate tension, that ensure due process, ensure human rights, but also balance the legitimate concerns of public order or sensitivities in a very delicate manner. So I just wanted to give you an example, because when you get people around the table, they apparently seem to be able to develop such a framework. And I can encourage you to come at 11:30. I have a flash session on this.
That's great. Thank you, Bertrand. A very interesting discussion on all the importance of introducing mechanisms for mediating, arbitrating some of these critical challenges around procedural enhancements and different due process frameworks. Thomas.
Again, I think I can build on what my panelists have already said. We do believe. Okay. We do believe that transparency is very important, and that we have a role in awareness raising also from the private sector. Now, in the past, all these security issues have been handled a bit secretive, I would say, and so for good reason. But having seen and having, I think, agreement that we need to work closely together on this, we also have to think about how we can actually provide everyone with the information necessary, and that means also talking about what is actually going on, what cyber attacks are happening, and what each and everyone can do. Now, as a company, we have to be aware that whenever, for example, we introduce an update to a system, that immediately everyone out there will know, oh, there must have been a vulnerability earlier. So what you want to know is what happens then with all the gadgets that do not make the update. For this reason, we have a sensor network out there that simulates both desktop computers and mobile phones, staying on the old system, being updated, just monitoring what are actually the attacks incoming. And those numbers are amazing. So we're going public as much as possible with this. There is websites that in real time allow to see what Deutsche Telekom comes up with findings. I think it has worked rather well in the past to work with governments for awareness raising in that respect and working on solutions together. Now, on the way forward, of course, it has been mentioned already, privacy by design should be a requirement, is a requirement. In my company, we have a board member that is exclusively responsible for data protection, and we also have a data protection board involving all relevant political parties. They look at new products, and they really do a hard testing, and more often than not, you have to go back, redesign or improve the design, and then go back to the board before you can actually launch it in the market. Now, as I've said before, German standards are very high, and we probably wouldn't need to adhere to them in all of our footprint countries, but we do, because we believe that it is necessary to level the playing field, not towards the bottom, but towards the top. So again, as I have said before, we should, in this respect, work towards international standards that are orientated towards the high end of the possibilities with regard to data protection. Last but not least, I think it's also important to keep in a dialogue with the leadership functions here, and for that reason Deutsche Telekom, together with the Munich Security Conference, is holding every year now for the third year in November the Cyber Security Summit, bringing together both political and economic leadership. And when I look back like 10 years ago, internet security was something that geeks and nerds would be talking about and being called Paranet. Today we are at the point where it's actually at CEO attention level, and CEOs know how important it is. So I think that is an excellent development for the past decade, and if we manage to bring the same awareness to the people in the street and give them the tools to protect themselves, that would be a major achievement.
And Bertrand, before you have experience with noise in adjoining rooms, would you mind maybe talking to someone for a moment? Thank you, Thomas. That's very helpful information on the privacy by design efforts that DT is making. Katica.
Thank you. So we were talking about, well, I'm civil society, so I have to bring, I really have to highlight the issues about the Snowden revelations, and we are talking about trust, and we are talking about solutions. And so I want to propose some to the business sector, but also to the companies, to see whether we can move forward on this real problem, because there will be no trust if we don't fix the problem. So a secure internet, I was saying that one thing that is important is a secure internet, because it's in everyone's interest. And this, I was saying previously that this arms race scenario is totally wrong, and we need to change that mentality. So cryptography works. Is we hear some of the Snowden interview, the first one, he said that crypto properly implemented works. This is an important lesson. Attackers, whether the government or unscrupulous, well, very unscrupulous, attackers, whether government or other kind of attackers, rely in data that is not encrypted. We have made too easy for governments to conduct bulk collection. Of course, there are many solutions, and many could be very complicated. It's a complex topic. You cannot solve it in just one country, because other country will do it. So we have to start changing the way we are doing things. And one is start companies probably rethinking this collecting everything business model. I know that will be very difficult, but probably is a smart decision, not only for data protection, but also vis-a-vis government access to that data. It's no longer it's obvious that it's no longer that you can keep this secret cooperation with the government, because we now know that it could be leaked. Probably in the past, you thought that your cooperation will remain secret, and you are losing business, you are losing money, you are losing clients. Your clients are not happy. So probably as a company of government's policies, you can promote that we should use more encryption, like encrypt the backbone, make eavesdropping, make spying more expensive. We do not know enough how to protect ourselves against the NSA or other intelligence agencies in the world if this is a targeted attack. But let's work together to make bulk collection expensive. Encrypt the backbone, encrypt the data that is not only in the cloud or seeds, but when it's in transit, when it goes in transit. Redesign products and service to have privacy enhancing by default. Secure endpoints, encryption, promote more anonymity tools, make encryption easier. Very, very simple, like OTR when you chat online. There are also solutions to do in the legal area, not only in the technical area. We know that the ability to eavesdrop on people's communication vests immense power in those who do it. And unless such power is held in check by rigorous oversight and accountability, it's almost certain to be abused, as we have learned from the leaks revealed by Snowden. So last year in the Human Rights Council, many civil society present a document we developed how to apply international human rights law in the context of communication surveillance. And we come up with 13 principles which are found in the necessaryandproportionate.org website. And it's legal background paper that explains where is the legal roots of all these principles. And with these principles, we are trying to explain government how existing human rights protections apply to the digital context. We are not asking to invest thousands of hours of drafting a new treaty. We already have a treaty. We are asking to enforce it and implement it. And we are planning how to do it in the context of communication surveillance. And we hope to have companies rally and support these principles. We have seen very little, and those are obligations, human rights obligations posed to states, where companies can help promote, so they become, or they probably not become complicit in the legal surveillance. So I know that there are many things to do, but I recommend you to read, if you are a government or you are a business sector, to read the necessary and proportionate principles that explain very clear how to adopt laws that will restrict human rights or the right to privacy. And if you are designing a new law, surveillance law, or reviewing the existing one, you have to know that this law has to be necessary, has to be proportionate, has to be adequate. It has to be comply with the principle of legality. So I recommend you to read it. It's on the website, and its legal background paper is also there. And it answers many of the questions that Bertrand posed about government access to citizens' data. So it's an in-depth document, and I only have 5 minutes, so I cannot go in depth, but please visit the website.
Thank you. I'll be brief so that we can get to your participation. I just wanted to bring a couple of examples of solutions that are actually in process. So remember when I spoke, we talked about the problem of individual participation, especially in previously collected information. So there's interesting work going on at the OECD between two of its committees, one on healthcare and one on security and privacy, where they're taking a look at what happens when you have previously collected medical information and a desire to use that information for another medical purpose, but one that wasn't noticed at the time the information was collected, and where there is an impracticability of getting back to the patient for getting a new individualized consent for a separate use of the information. And the idea was the purpose is laudable, the purpose is societally beneficial, but because you don't have individual participation, the person in the decision-making process, you have to build new safeguards into the system. So one of the things they're looking at is how you would define use-based models for that kind of information. And we have precedents for those concepts. They're called ethical research protocols. They're currently what's used in medical research. But those protocols are used on a per inquiry basis. So every time you essentially have a new question, it's a new set of permissions that you're getting. The concept here is, can you develop use-based models which are replicable, which streamline some of the delay and some of the expense while not shortcutting any of the safety or the protection? So you would still be able to say, well, you need to control access, you need to encrypt the information to make secure, you can only share the information in this fashion, a use is still limited to this purpose. So you create a set of control parameters around that information to create assurance that the information is being used in a correct fashion, is probably within the zone of foreseeability of use, but it frees the ability to use that information in a more cohesive fashion with less administrative burden related to it, while still maintaining the safeguards. Another thing which is underway is kind of going towards Bertrand's issue of jurisdiction. Within APEC, which is the Asia-Pacific Cooperation, think everything that has a Pacific coast, which means, Russia, which means the Asian countries, which means the Latin American countries that have a Pacific coast. They have something called cross-border privacy rules. Those of you familiar with EU privacy may be familiar with the concept of binding corporate rules. Essentially, in both cases, there are sets of rules that would bind a company and its affiliates to a set of privacy practices which are validated. And that binding and validation and vetting by an authority then gives that company the right to transfer information pursuant to those rules across its affiliates. There's a project going on in APEC which is very promising. The CNIL, which is the French Data Protection Authority, the ICO, which is the UK's data protection authority, one of the German data protection authorities, the European Commission, as well as the commissioner on these issues for the EU, the data privacy officer, Peter Husting's office, also has a representative. They are working with the data privacy subgroup in APEC to do a mapping between the binding corporate rules and the cross-border privacy rules. And that mapping is to see what kind of overlap there is between these instruments. And they've finished what they call a referential. Essentially, they took the two documents and they tried to do that overlap mapping. And they figured out there was a fairly large overlap, maybe 75% or so of the requirements are actually fairly similar. And so the next step in the process is to start to determine, well, if I validated your compliance to my program, and validating your compliance to my program is worth 75% of validating your compliance to this other program, how do I give you credit for the 75% you've already accomplished, and then how do I figure out how to hold you responsible for the 25% you haven't met? And again, what this is doing is simplifying the administration of working across different jurisdictional formats. Because at the end of the day, privacy is something that is built within a legal framework, within a set of cultural norms and expectations, and within a set of individual priorities and preferences. And it is very difficult to say we are going to figure out how to develop a global standard on this. Companies can develop an operational standard which tries to bridge a lot of these issues, but the more we can come up with ways in which we can map regulations to each other, map compliance paradigms to each other, and not undercut the level of regulation in any country, but rather facilitate the exchange of information and the lack of duplication in filings, the lack of duplication in requirements, then we have made interoperability of systems at a policy level something that is fairly innovative, because we're getting better at interoperability at a technical level, but we're not very good at interoperability at a policy level. So this is a very interesting attempt at developing policy interoperability. I'll make one comment to the positive sum, zero sum that Bertrand and Eric both mentioned, and Anne Kavoukian, the former commissioner for Ontario, has done a lot of work in this area also. But I think part of the problem is we continue to use the word balance. We have to balance these interests. And the word balance, by definition, has inherently a winner and a loser. And I think what we have to start talking about is optimizing. Because there are ways in which you can actually maximize both if you think about it in the correct paradigm. The way I like to think about it is 1 + 1 = 3, and let's call it the new math. Because the whole is in fact greater than the sum of its parts, if you think about optimization as opposed to less than the sum of its parts. And just because we should probably have a provocative statement at the beginning of this, I just wanted to ask Bertrand a question. You thought it was a bad idea to push some of this ethical decision-making to companies. What do you think the Spanish court did in the right to be forgotten?
If I may, I didn't mean I think it is a bad thing. I said there are criticisms about the fact that companies have this quasi-judiciary role. And to answer your question, if there was a vindication that the highest court in Europe is actually saying that they have this role, this is a fascinating turn of events, because de facto this is becoming an element, at the same time saying that appeal mechanisms are needed. This is what the court said. How this decision is going to be implemented is a very interesting question at the moment.
If I may, just for a moment, Khatit said, and I'm sure we will get a point in, but a couple of quick acknowledgements, and we want to go to the room. First, Constance Weiss with the ICC Secretariat is our remote moderator, and I see we have some remote participants. And Erica Mann from Facebook is our rapporteur, and we are going to be gathering the both statements of challenge and also the ways forward for a report from this session. Now, at this moment, we have a couple of microphones. I do want to make sure that we have some interventions. And Constance, why don't we start if there is a question from one of the remote participants to the panel?
Right, thank you, Eric. Can you hear me?
No.
No.
Or you can come on up, Constance, perhaps.
Yeah.
I see.
So there's a question for Bertrand from Faisal Hassan, ISOC Bangladesh in Dhaka, who says, you mentioned, Bertrand, there is no platform or procedure to resolve cross-border issues that creates tension and violence. I heard the same thing from you 2 years ago. What have we achieved through all the discussions in the last 2 years, and are we going anywhere? Thank you.
The answer will be very simple. The session that I was mentioning at 11:30 in room 2 will be a presentation of the current stage of the Internet and Jurisdiction project. And there is another, i.e. the framework that is now being developed by the participants. And we have another session, a workshop on will cyberspace fragment along national jurisdictions on Thursday at 2:30. So that will be the best. At the moment, the framework is being organized around the elements that I mentioned, and it would be long to explain now, as the session today will be better answered.
Okay, may I go to the room here for any comments or questions? We have one up front. Can we have the microphone?
I just want to ask about the privacy seal, the seal you're talking
introductions
about.
As well.
I'm Pernille Treinberg from Copenhagen, Denmark, the business authority. I want to hear about the privacy seal you're discussing at the EU level. How far are you, and will companies like Facebook, Google, practicing the free model, will they be able to have a seal like that? And second, private companies, what do you think about that idea of a privacy seal?
Anna, first.
Thank you for the question. Of course, the question is, the answer is that we have this model in Europe, and we have these US companies. So it's up to Europe and its governments to understand what it means that we have mainly US companies working in Europe, because they are not going to follow the rules of Europe if we are talking about a technology like cloud, etc., that doesn't know any boundaries. So we really have to rethink at European level, but globally. That's so the point is that, I don't know whether I should elaborate a little more on this, but the point is that Europe should wake up.
Joe, you also had?
Yeah, just from a company perspective, for a number of companies who participate in the Safe Harbor already participate in SEAL programs. The APEC process also has SEAL programs. From a security certification point of view, a number of companies also obtain SEAL programs related to security. I would say the one concern I would have is some examples of SEAL programs try to be technology specific. In other words, they try to say your technology should implement a policy outcome, when policy outcomes are implemented by technology, people, and process. You cannot just look at technology and say that's sufficient. You have to look at technology, people, and process. So I think holistic SEALs are the ways to go. I think what we've found in the US also is, and the UK is exploring this as well as the EU, is how you leverage, because authorities themselves don't usually have the capacity to run a full-blown SEAL program, and sometimes they feel conflicted because it's hard to be both the enforcement operator and the one who gave you the SEAL. There's a slight conflict of interest perhaps in that. And so part of the question is how you actually create potential private operators who operate under government supervision in order to administer these seals.
I see Patrick Azaleas just raised his hand a moment ago. Just a couple points that have been raised about the role that companies should play, both some of the things that Katitza had mentioned, and Patrick, you started the work on the telecommunications industry dialogue.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Patrik Hiselius. I come from Telia Sonera in Stockholm. There was a question about solutions, and as you know, in 2011 we had the UN framework on protect, respect, remedy, and the telcos, 9 global telcos sat together and defined what does respect mean in our sector when it comes to freedom of expression and privacy. And we launched now 18 months ago, March last year, a set of guiding principles, industry best practice on how to respect. And those are available on our homepage, telecomindustrydialogue.org, in, I believe, 7 different languages. And we are here to answer any questions to that regard. AT&T, obviously Telia Sonera, Orange, Telefonica, and other operators present during the IGF are actively working, implementing those principles, and engaging in dialogue with interested stakeholders. Thank you.
Katitza, I want to return to you. I know you had a comment before. I'm not sure. Still? Okay. No? Okay, another here. Okay, thank you. Please.
Yes, about the fiscal incentive that the suggestion of Ms. Neves earlier, how effective do you think is the suggestion about giving fiscal incentives, given that in developing countries we have been giving fiscal incentives to private sector and we haven't really experienced any progress in services that we've given fiscal incentives?
Mukesh, on incentives? Any comments on this question of incentives?
I raised the point. So about the fiscal incentives. So again, at the European Union level, of course, it doesn't work at European Union and European Commission's level. It has to be up to each member state because the fiscal policy is not a European policy. So it should be up to each member state to decide what to do at the national level. Why? Because they want that their industry will develop and will be very competitive and will be advanced in this ecosystem where we have mainly US companies working. The fiscal incentives is, I think, it's something that we are thinking about, but of course at national level, and it can really stimulate. It depends, but it really can stimulate. I don't know whether I answered to your question.
Yeah, a question at the back.
Yeah, my name is Christopher Segoyan. I work for the ACLU in Washington, D.C. I have a question for the 2 gentlemen working for AT&T and Deutsche Telekom on the panel. 1 year ago, Der Spiegel revealed that Angela Merkel's telephone calls had been intercepted, likely using equipment that had been around for 20 years, a device called an IMSI catcher, which was actually originally created in Germany. And this is a widely available surveillance device. You can now build one yourself for about $1,000. And in fact, in June of this year, Newsweek in the United States revealed that foreign governments in the United States were operating these devices and spying on the phone calls of politicians and policymakers in Washington. To be clear, these are not the NSA operating in Washington. These are other governments, just as the US government and others spy around the world. My questions to the gentleman from AT&T and Deutsche Telekom are, 1 year later, what are you doing, 1, to warn your customers about the risks, and 2, what are you doing to protect your customers from these risks of private interception and interception by governments other than the people, other than those of the people being targeted. The cost of interception has become so cheap. There are technologies that are available, but the carriers have not rolled them out and have not warned people, why have you not done anything, or what have you done?
Okay, I'll go first. I think in Germany the awareness of such practices is very, very high. What have we done is the more interesting part. We have made one proposal which has been heavily criticized, which now goes under the heading of Internet of Short Distances, which means we don't see a necessity for information to take a trip around the world if the destination is actually within Germany or within Europe. I'll be happy to discuss this, as I don't see it as a fragmentation of the internet, but merely a redesign of the routing. The other part that we are now doing is we are actively encrypting all email communication for our customers. That is a direct reaction to the awareness that if you don't do it, everything you send on the internet is effectively like a postcard.
And as well, it's a constant process of both strengthening the protection of your networks as well as working on procedural strengthening of safeguards within the process. And both efforts are ones that AT&T are actively working on, always have been, and always will continue to. Do we have any other questions or comments? One final one, and then we will do a wrap-up.
It's for Joe, so it's Pat Walsh, GSMA. Joe, very much appreciated the discussion on interoperability, but what I see missing often in this, whether at the OECD, APEC or elsewhere, are telecom regulators, because it is a fact that we have telco-specific rules that may be imposed upon fixed and mobile operators around the world, which require many more things than they do, say, on the Googles, Yahoos, or Facebooks of the world. And they're often missing from this dialogue. And in terms of interoperability, I mean, I'm working in countries where there are no formal data protection frameworks, but the right to privacy or communications privacy may be enshrined in constitutions. So how do we map for that to create this global map of interoperability?
Well, I think, you know, the EU is an interesting paradigm of that discussion even as we speak, because the data protection regulation is being rewritten in the shadow of the e-privacy directive, which is a directive more specifically associated with those on the communications side of the issue. And then there are complete regulatory structures outside of either the e-privacy directive or the draft regulation, which are also things that need to be looked at. So you're right, the telecom regulators are not, in fact, part of those discussions. In all honesty, the APEC process will be difficult to do that in, because APEC is a fractured organization in the sense that there's the APEC and then there's something called the APEC-TEL, which is where the telecom side of the equation meets. They conveniently do not meet in the same city or at the same time, making the meeting of the minds geographically impossible. So I think what we would look at it in APEC is as a sequential process, that once we figure out how to do it with the privacy regulators, we may then send it over to the organization that has the telecom folks, because I do think it is important. Now, some of the telecom regulation, which may have an implication in privacy, is not necessarily privacy focused, but has a privacy impact. That is going to be much more difficult to deal with. Something like the e-privacy directive is specifically on privacy. Within the EU, I'm pretty sure that what happens is when the draft regulation is finished, the e-privacy directive will be harmonized to the privacy regulation, but that does mean that telcos especially are essentially keeping this two-stack alive until they actually know what to do, because they've got one set of regulatory requirements coming from one side of the equation and a different set of regulatory requirements morphing on the other. And there is, to this date, in the data protection regulation, no grandfathering of saying, well, you're already covered by this regulation, so therefore you don't need to worry about it. That would be one of the elegant solutions were that to happen, but that, as far as I know, is not yet happening unless there's been a development that I'm not aware of related to that. But yeah, it's an issue. Telcos are not the only ones. Financial services companies are regulated with financial services regulation that has privacy impact. Every company that has employees has HR regulation that has privacy impact. So we have an extremely complex web in which we have not just different requirements, but different ways of phrasing things. To give you a case in point, the HIPAA regulation in the United States is the regulation related to healthcare privacy. And there's a privacy rule and a security rule. And interestingly enough, these rules were finished 1 year apart from each other. And they have a different definition of personal information. So a company is required to follow this law to implement both the privacy rule and the security rule, but the rules within the same law have a different definition for what personal information is. Now, if you can't get harmonization right within the same law, we are all beating our heads against the wall for a long time. The only kind of saving grace in all of this is for those of you in the audience who are involved in privacy, you have guaranteed job security for some time to come.
So with that, I appreciate all of the interventions from the panel, the audience. We are going to prepare a summary of this. I think, as Joe said well, of the efforts to optimize all of the interests here. And several of the ideas raised here to try to get to a positive sum really came down to the need for working on more mechanisms to arbitrate the differences across jurisdictions. A very interesting example that Joe raised of the cooperation between APEC and the Article 29 Working Group, of what Bertrand is working on as well. A lot of focus on the need for procedural enhancements. The need to develop independent oversight of mandates and to come up with methods to ensure that formats of requests work out in a good way. We didn't talk too much about transparency and transparency reporting. It came up some, but again, one of the critical issues. And of course, the need, as Mukesh raised, for active investment on security, to be fully aware of the risk environment out there, to analyze where the risk assets are, and to make strengthening efforts in there. So we'll capture these points. We thank you very much for your participation today, and I thank all the panelists, our remote moderator, and our rapporteur.